We welcome you to the Believe in USC podcast with the kickoff of the season just around the corner, September 1st, when the Trojans head to Las Vegas to take on LSU. I'm Cooper Perkins, your host, and thrilled to be joined by star writer of the Southern California News Group, Luca Evans. He is, in my opinion, first on the beat with just about everything USC, and also one of the few voices that you can count on to always be honest about what's going on inside the USC program. Luca, I know it's been a busy morning for you. You've had time, be running around making calls, going to practice, but as always, appreciate your time coming on the show with us.
Well, star is a bit of a long shot, but I appreciate the compliment, Cooper, and always happy and excited to be on. And yeah, let's talk some USC. A lot of things to cover before we head to Vegas.
Yes, sir. So let's start with what was the biggest news of the week. Not really surprising news, but still it's noteworthy because it's official now. Miller Moss is named the starting quarterback for the Trojans. One thing that really interested me, though, was Lincoln Riley talking about the quarterback competition after that announcement was made. And I'm curious what your perspective is. You've gotten to see a lot more practice in spring and fall than the vast majority of people. How close do you think that race actually was? Because if you listen to what Lincoln said and take him at his word, it sounds like Jayden Maiava's knocking on the door of starting, but is that really true?
I think it's interesting because I think the truth falls somewhere between, what everyone kind of on the beat and in the media and the fans expected. This, honestly speaking, this was Miller Moss's team ever since, he lit up the Holiday Bowl. You had guys talking about how excited they were to play with him. You had, just players openly endorsing him to be the starter. And so there was little doubt, even when Jayden Maiava came in the spring. I think that, this was Miller's team, and this was his shot. He operated like it. The program, he went and talked at USC, brought him to Big Ten Media Day in Indianapolis. That wouldn't have been the case if, Lincoln was planning to start Jayden Maiava week one throughout that whole process. So this has been his team, but I do think there is, truth to Lincoln's words. And I think also, maybe just a little bit of, I don't want to say gamesmanship, but there is, I'm sure, the desire still to push Miller Moss, and he's not going to be a guy that's just gonna kind of sit on his laurels after that December. And even Miller Moss said himself, talking with us this week, that Jayden Maiava has pushed him, and when you look at just their kind of physical attributes. And you're picking the two just at face value of who's going to start for USC quarterback. Jayden Maiava is he's a big kid. He's got a really strong arm. He's fast, and the key for him is just ultimately leadership and learning the playbook. So as that kind of progressed, I'm sure that there was, I don't know if you want to call it a competition, but just kind of I'm sure that they pushed each other in the room a little bit. I do think, though, that ultimately Miller was going to be the guy throughout, fall camp. I don't think there was any doubt to that. And, I think that's why probably, some of the reason why there was so little fanfare around it from him, when the decision came to light. But a really cool just opportunity for him, and a really unique story kind of in the modern landscape of college sports.
Yeah, and if you haven't seen the latest from Luca, wrote a great piece about Miller Moss and his ascent into this moment. And I just want to kind of peel back a little further into that, because I think Moss is such an interesting story for multiple reasons. The most obvious of which, right, being he's a fourth-year junior that is stuck in the same program through two official coaches, really three if you count Dante Jackson. But it's one of those situations where he is not your normal quarterback, right? Like, this kid does come from a privileged family, does come from a very comfortable upbringing, but his parents deliberately put him in situations to foster that growth and to make him uncomfortable. He then figured out that, challenges, as the old line goes, right, the obstacle is the way. That's the Miller Moss thing these days. The obstacle is the way. But I'm just curious, what has your experience been like interacting with him and observing him, right? Because there's the football side of things, and then there's everything that's not football. And in many ways, to the untrained eye, Miller Moss appears to be something of a leadership savant, maybe. And I'm curious, to what extent is that perception valid, and what do you see in your line of sight?
I think the interesting thing with him is that he clearly is a natural leader and has just assumed the reins so much of this USC team and inhibits that role. I think the really interesting thing with him, though, is like, you know, I wouldn't necessarily say leadership savant, is more just he's just kind of a guy. Like he's, I think in this modern era of, NIL and I go into this, or went into this a little bit in the story, but like modern quarterback development has become such like a sleek science, to where a lot of these kids are on this path to be, starting collegiate quarterbacks and NFL guys. They're put on that path from a really young age. And Miller Moss certainly had some of that, but he also just, he was a multidisciplinary kid. And, he's at USC, he's in a frat. Like you can just kind of tell that, he carries himself with like, he's just kind of a guy on campus. And you kind of think back to like the old age of the collegiate quarterback who was, who kind of inhibited that sense of community almost around the team. And it feels like Miller Moss is that guy in a lot of respects from what he's just been able to do. I think one of the most, and ultimately we're going to look at this year and say, maybe it doesn't fully work out for him. There's certainly no guarantees. He's not a sure thing. He's not a sure thing Heisman candidate like so many guys Lincoln Riley has had. But I think the unique thing, the thing that makes him easy to root for a lot of USC fans, is like he was by no means Lincoln Riley's guy. Like Lincoln Riley's guy was Caleb Williams when he came in from Oklahoma, and then Lincoln Riley's guy was Malachi Nelson, from Los Alamitos, and Miller was sandwiched in between those two guys, and almost anyone across the country probably would have left in that scenario. And Miller Moss loved USC so much, and you can tell by his background and just the way he talks about it that, he loved this campus and just the school so much and valued it that he was going to stick around. And, there's some of that competitive factor in it too. So, and you can just tell, like, he carries himself with this kind of, air that just, he knows who he is. Like you can just tell it by the way he walks. He's always talking with his receivers or something like that. He seems to just be good buddies with them. Jacoby Lane, I was talking to him at media day, and he was like, about him and Miller's connection. And he was like, yeah, I mean, we, it's certainly hanging off the field like strengthens that, but we also just hang out because we're just friends. Like, I'm not hanging out with them to like, try and foster a quarterback receiver connection. So I do think Miller has that impact of like, he's just a guy. He's not out here. And not to say that, this was the wrong path by any means. I think Caleb Williams' teammates all pretty much universally praised him at USC, but, he was a figure. Like he made, what the Athletic reported, $10 million in NIL earnings at his time at USC. And you see Miller Moss like doing Hollister ads and, post on Instagram, and all his teammates kind of clowning him for it. It's just that he seems a little bit more that kind of just down to earth, like old school guy. And I think there's something to that from a leadership perspective. And we'll see how it's going to work out.
This is interesting. And my thoughts on Miller Moss and kind of observing the reporting on him and watching kind of how he interacts with the media. He feels like he's what JT Daniels was supposed to be, but in reality, they are polar opposites. And that's not something to take a shot at JT Daniels. I mean, that was a very difficult time to be a quarterback at USC for anyone. I mean, that was a situation in which, especially as a kid that should have been in his senior year of high school, was set up to fail, and it just never worked out for him. But, Miller Moss is one of the few players that I think we can label like a Trojan, as opposed to a guy who played or plays football at USC. Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with either of those two, but like I find myself so excited to root for him just purely because he's one of us, like he's put in the time, he's stuck around, and for a fourth year junior to get your first opportunity. I mean, like that, not that long ago, that was pretty normal, right? Mark Sanchez, John David Booty, like those guys were redshirt juniors. but that's just so unheard of now. So I think that I share this with most of the fan base. Just there's this sense of desperately hoping things work out for him, not just because that means wins on the field, but just because it means he deserves and has earned with biding his time and the hard work he's put in, and the relentless confidence in his own process that he would get this chance. So I think it's a really interesting storyline, because when's the last time you can think of a guy that was really, really easy to root for, like under center for USC? I mean,
yeah,
Caleb was very polarizing. I know Trojan fans loved him. At times were frustrated with his style of play because of how erratic it could be, despite being explosive and exceptional. Keaton Slovis had a very brief honeymoon. JT Daniels hardly had any honeymoon once he started on campus. And it's one of those weird dynamics where, like, we've almost been waiting for someone to fill like that USC savior role. And Caleb Williams did that statistically, right, winning a Heisman and putting up an 11-win season, but like it still felt borrowed to some extent. Like he became a Trojan. He spent more time at USC than Oklahoma. But like if you're watching Hard Knocks, right, he's introducing himself to the team and he's saying, horns down.
Yeah, horns down, fight on. Yeah,
I get it. You're both, but like Miller's not both. Miller's a USC guy, and I'm curious what that's going to look like for the offense. And there's started to be a little bit of a national talking point that's developed a little bit. People like Joel Klatt, Colin Cowherd, who have been very bullish on USC in the last week after being either silent or selling their stock for most of the offseason.
Yep.
And I'm curious whether or not you think there's validity to that talking point, that the offense will go back to being a Lincoln Riley offense as opposed to being a Caleb Williams offense. And what does that mean? Like Miller Moss is himself. He's not Baker Mayfield. He's not Kyler Murray. He's not Jalen Hurts. But like we know what a Lincoln Riley offense looks like. Do you think that talking point has much validity to it? And to what extent do you think we're going to see like a different product out there with a new guy under center?
Well, I think it's a really good, just general talking point. I'm working on a story right now on how, Lincoln's offense has kind of evolved over the years, starting out as, an offensive coordinator at East Carolina when things were super up tempo, and he came in saying, we're going to run 100 plays a game and operating with that mentality, and how that's progressed over the years, introducing the run game more, and how he's just kind of utilized how things have looked with different quarterbacks. And so I think the thing that's interesting I think that angle is a little bit blown up to the point where like it wasn't like Caleb Williams was just like freestyling constantly in Lincoln Riley's offense. I think that point is a little bit overblown to like, he wasn't this like complete chaos agent all the time. He had, he made that happen sometimes, but last year the offense was still predicated so much on, quick hits, getting the ball out fast, getting guys like, Zachariah Branch, Taj Washington, the variety of receivers in space, getting the ball out quick. And you had those times, the breakdowns really were more because the offensive line had issues. At times the receivers kind of struggled to separate, on deep routes. And so Caleb would do his thing. I do think though, and it was interesting, I had this conversation with a former quarterback for Lincoln, East Carolina, Shane Carden, and he was watching the Holiday Bowl, and he said he thought it was really interesting because it reminded him more of the East Carolina days when, they would just kind of go out and cut out a lot of the, quick hit, motion type stuff and just kind of play football and be free and, run four verts. And I do think you'll see a little bit more of that this season. And then in addition, Miller's thing is he's going to play on schedule and he's going to play on time. I do think that fits well with what Lincoln Riley's offense is trying to do. The question is, there's an upside and there's a downside to that. And if things, the offensive line still to me is maybe USC's biggest question mark entering the year. And if that's a consistent problem, Lincoln Riley's offense is founded on avoiding negative plays, and that was a thing that Caleb even had trouble with last year. And if the O-line is has so much trouble again that Miller Moss can't consistently play the way that he needs to, I don't think he maybe doesn't have the improvisational or creative ability that Caleb does to still uplift an entire offense. So I do think there's a positive aspect to it where maybe Miller will, maybe things will operate even more efficiently, and maybe he'll spread the ball out even more than he did. But there's a downside to where, if things are going badly, Miller Moss, I don't think is going to be that savior, pivot out of the pocket and dodge three guys and throw a, 45-yard corner route to a guy who makes a sideline catch. Like, I don't, he had a great performance in the Holiday Bowl, but I don't know if that's necessarily going to happen. So it's a little bit of give and take. Definitely an interesting point for sure.
Now, you mentioned, the basis of Lincoln's offense, and, obviously the transition to the Big Ten comes this year. That'll start, on the fourth week of the season, third game when they go to the Big House to play Michigan. And it's another kind of national talking point that has just been taken almost as like a dogmatic piece that, these West Coast teams are going to have to adjust to the Big Ten. And that's such an interesting perspective to have, because I'm not sure it isn't the other way around, that these Big Ten because look at Ohio State, right? That's the only team in the Big Ten that consistently has had a powerful spread the field, get it down the field offense, and they've dominated everyone they've played but Michigan for 10 years. And so I'm wondering, is this offense more equipped for this season than we think? And I don't know how you can make that, how you can draw a conclusion about that until we see it. But it's just fascinating to think about, are these Big Ten defenses that good, or are they just consistently playing offenses that are so inept and void of talent at the skill positions that this will, be a new challenge for them that they might not be equipped to handle? What do you think? I'm not sure if there have been any conversations, that have been had that you maybe overheard. Obviously, don't tip anyone's hand here, but I'm curious if there's a sentiment that has spread throughout the program as to what that transition is going to look like. Are they feeling like, they're going to have to adjust to us? Or is there a little bit more of that, we'll have to change some things and we'll have to, get bigger in these areas or whatever? What's it sound like when you're around practice?
Well, I'll speak first to, again, for that story, talking to coaches, who've crossed paths with Lincoln here and there. They feel like it's a given that USC is going to have to bulk up and, is going to have to play well on the lines of scrimmage. But that applies for just about any football team. USC didn't play well in the Pac-12, last year at times because they were getting, pushed around at the line of scrimmage at times by, Oregon and that sort of thing. And I do think, there are plenty of coaches who feel like Big Ten defenses are going to have to adjust to, the aggressiveness that Lincoln Riley plays with on offense, and the amount of talent and weapons and concepts that he can throw. I do think that's certainly an adjustment factor. And I think the other part of this too is that, when you think Big Ten, you think smash mouth football, you think the ground game. And I think when people think of the Lincoln Riley offense, you think of, the Mike Leach influence, the air raid, the just that sort of brilliance through the air. And the thing that's really evolved in Lincoln's offense over the years is his incorporation of, the run game. He did it really well at Oklahoma. It was at times, you could certainly have argued that it could have been more of an emphasis last year. And so it's going to be really interesting to see how that comes into play in the Big Ten. I don't know if, Mississippi State transfer Woody Marks, I don't know if he's a 15 carry a game kind of guy. Sophomore Quentin Joyner looks like he can kind of, maybe certainly factor in a little bit there, be a guy who can break off a lot of explosive runs. But I think that's a big piece too. And I think when you hear Lincoln Riley talk about it, ultimately it's kind of that football is football sentiment. What are Big Ten teams doing ultimately that's so different? couple tight end formations here and there, like you said that back in the spring. And so I think, there was a natural, like everyone has admitted, Lincoln and the defensive coaches and players themselves, that's been an emphasis that they've needed to bulk up for the Big Ten, at least in part. But I think Lincoln would also make the point that this is something that they needed to do program wide, irrespective of the Big Ten. So I think it's a little bit of both. The question still, though, is yes, I do think, his offense will take these teams by storm. I really think that the question mark on USC's roster right now, things look, I think a lot more stable and a lot more healthy than, than some schools of thought might think. I think the question mark is really just at the lines of scrimmage. Do they have the depth, the talent on the defensive line to consistently, take advantage of a pretty strong secondary that they've built? And do they have enough experience on the offensive line to give Miller Moss the time to play on schedule and execute Lincoln's offense? So I think to me, that's the going in circles, but that's the question mark.
Well, and kind of to your point, I'll raise this question to you. This is something that kind of has circulated on the message boards the last few weeks. Excluding the quarterback position, right? You take out Caleb Williams. Is it fair to say that USC is better at every position on the field now? I kind of think the answer to that is yes. We do have questions about the line play up front, but it cannot be worse on the defensive line than it was last year.
Yeah. And
offensively, I think there is reason to be optimistic. Guys like Elijah Page stepping into a bigger role, having had a full offseason to develop. But, from your assessment, you think that's a fair, claim to make, that outside of quarterback, the Trojans have a pretty reasonable claim to being better at every position?
I think they'll be it depends certainly on youth and experience in some areas. I think if you look at the potential of the receiver room, that's definitely there. Now with some young guys, if the growth that we've seen from guys like Mekhi Lemon and Jacoby Lane and Deuce Robinson, if that stalls a little bit, then you can make an argument that position maybe isn't as deep or as ready as it was last year. But I think outside of that, the secondary, to me, the secondary might be the most deep position group on the roster, period, which is a huge change from last year. I think that's, I think if there's one area to get really excited about USC this year, I think it is the secondary and just the coaching additions there. I think the linebackers will be improved, just with Easton Mascarenas Arnold. I think Mason Cobb will be better than he was last year. Eric Gentry is always kind of a wild card, but I think he has more of a rapport with the coaching staff, so certainly possible there. The defensive line, I could see that. I think my only question is I don't. The running back room is a little bit thin. It's strong. It's got talent, but it is thin. There's only 4 guys there that, if there are injuries, there's not a lot of depth. And again, I don't know if Woody Marks is like a bell cow kind of guy, or even, at the is going to rush for as much as Marshawn Lloyd did last year. So I would say in general that assessment is fairly accurate. I'm still a little bit shaky on the O-line, particularly the right side of the O-line. I think that's a pretty massive question mark, but I think that's pretty fair to say, which leaves them and kind of their prognosis in like an interesting place. I could see them, if things go poorly, it's like, the floor is 7 wins and the ceiling is 10, 11 or something like that. There's kind of a wide range here of what could happen. So, yeah.
Yeah, that wide range is really interesting because when you go up and down the schedule, you can pick out the games that they need to win and then the games that you need to win 2 of 3 or 1 of
Yeah.
3, whatever it is. One of those games is their opener, not this upcoming Sunday, but September 1st, the ensuing Sunday. It'll be the only game on because it's Labor Day weekend. It's the special time slot where the Trojans will play LSU. And, I was able to pick up a little bit of intel on the LSU side of that, actually, a couple of weeks ago. I was down in South Carolina working a golf event. My broadcast partner has a brother who works as a fairly high-level staffer on the LSU staff. And we were talking about that game and just kind of chatting about. And, she explained to me that, inside the building, they do not under any circumstances think this is the year. They're not looking at this year as their run to the championship. They're looking at it as a borderline, maybe we'll make the playoff year. LSU, correct. Which raises the question of why do you think the national perception of that matchup seems to be so locked in on LSU is clearly the favorite. They're going to push around USC up front, and they're touchdown favorites. It could end up being a 2-score game. That just doesn't ring true to me, especially with a little bit of intel on the other side, knowing that they're not as bullish on their own team as most of the national media folks are, which I think is fascinating and probably something that's rare. If anything, you'd have the inverse more often than not, where inside the building, there's more optimism than there is outside the building. So I'm curious as to, how you make sense of that. How do you make sense of this matchup and this national narrative that, like LSU is, clearly cut to be the team that wins this opener?
Yeah, I think it kind of plays into more of like a conversation around, what the national kind of perception of USC is. Because in a sense, like you look at the roster now and so much of it is predicated on depth and guys, stepping into roles, and there's no, it's no longer a known commodity. Like you no longer have, it's not Caleb Williams versus LSU anymore. It's like, it's Miller Moss. And what I think the other interesting aspect is like, I think you're right. Like, as much questions around, USC's passing game, whatever their offense, like LSU, Garrett Nussmeier's in the same position that Miller Moss is, going into year 4 and starting for the first time. And it's an interesting question. I don't know why, I think the betting lines are like, I think they're slowly coming around to USC.
They're starting to quiver a little bit as the money comes in on USC because.
But LSU was pretty heavily favored
all offseason, 6.5 points the whole offseason, which is interesting, especially because not just in the big picture of how is this LSU team going to be. You have to think that week 1 they're going to be at their most vulnerable, as many teams are, but especially when you integrate a new offensive coordinator, right? Offenses under new leadership tend to take between 4 and 6 weeks to hit their stride. There's all the spring practice and fall camp that you could have, but still it's just this consistent pattern across college football that it takes a third to half of the season for a new offense to really find its identity and its rhythm, because it's just a reps thing, right? It's just these guys getting reps in that system with each other. And like to your point about Garrett Nussmeier, he not only is he in the same position as Miller Moss, LSU is also replacing 2 first-round wide receivers who were high picks, right? So you're now in a situation where you have inexperienced wide receivers. That's a position group that historically struggles early in seasons because there are so many nuances to the position. What does their wide receiver room look like when it gets down to brass tacks? We don't really know yet, but I think it's just so interesting why that narrative has been largely unquestioned on the national level. I remember talking to Barrett Salee a couple months ago on this show, who's a national analyst, the College Football Smothered and Covered podcast through Believe. And he made a couple of points about USC that felt valid, but not holistically significant enough to really condemn the program in the way that I think so many folks wanted to throughout the offseason. And I look at that opening matchup and I look at that as a must-win game. That's not we play well against LSU but lose. We can live with that. I think you need to start 2-0 because that Michigan game is going to be a nightmare, regardless of who's coaching, regardless of who's playing quarterback. We saw it with Stanford. Jim Harbaugh leaves, and there's a momentum in his programs that lasts 3 to 6 years. Michigan will slowly peter off at some point, but it's not going to be week 3 this season, week 4, whatever it is. So you look at that LSU game. And I think it's a lot bigger than just a season opener on a Sunday in a fun venue. It's a prove it game, and it's a prove it game in multiple facets. It's a prove it for Miller Moss. It's a prove it that they know how to tackle for the first time in 10 years. It's a prove it for D'Anton Lynn that that secondary is in fact going to cause problems. And I wonder what your perspective is on Lincoln in this situation, because all of his behavior this offseason since last year ended kind of screams of like a scorched earth. I'm going to show you, right? Like firing everybody, spending all the money that he could get his hands on to hire these elite defensive coaches, totally changing so much of the philosophy to emphasize something that in many ways flew in the face of his previous, bedrock foundation for his programs. How do you think he's approaching this? Because we've seen him in the last couple of years really hold back early in the season. I don't think we saw the full playbook until the Washington game last year. I kind of get the sense, and I could be wrong about this, you'll have a better feel for him than I do, that that's not going to be the case here. I think he looks at this LSU game the same way that I see it, as this is a statement game. This isn't we're going to get our feet beneath us and we're going to try and play well and see it. We'll learn what we have. That's every coach's favorite thing to say. We'll learn who we are. We'll learn what we have. I think he's going to come at this from the perspective of, I know what we have and we're going to show you. How do you make sense of Lincoln's behavior? What's your sense of his general demeanor? It just is so interesting because the behavior is such a departure from how he's done things in the past.
Well, we'll find out certainly a lot more this upcoming week, how he's thinking about specifically that LSU game. In general, I would tend to definitely agree with you that I don't think USC by any means is looking at this, as an early season, tune-up game by any means. And they shouldn't. This is LSU. I think what's interesting is Lincoln's total outlook on this season as a whole. And I think that speaks a little bit to, in every kind of opportunity, and we saw it mainly at Big Ten Media Days, like there's this balancing act between, him, asserting, we're USC, we're at the top of this conference, we're at the top of any conference. He said those words, but also emphasizing still so much how they are in the middle of their rebuild. He thinks it's on schedule, but again, using that word, rebuild, and this is a program now that, yes, when he came in, things were in dire straits, and I think that first year accelerated expectations certainly than maybe what was realistic, but at the same time, you can't claim rebuild anymore after a third season. You can't go into next year saying we're still getting this thing right. You can't go into year 4 saying that. And so this, in many ways, it is a transitional season, but it is a prove it year for a whole lot of people on this USC roster. I know there's a whole lot of national media talk around, this year's going to prove if Lincoln Riley can coach and yada, yada. I don't think that's, at much the issue is Lincoln Riley's whole vision for this program that he had when he first came into USC. Is it legitimately on the right track? Is his philosophy for as a program builder, going to pay off? I think that is the big question for this year. And so, I do think a strong year this way goes, there's a catastrophic difference between what a good year and what a bad year would mean for for him and for this program. And so I don't think they have any choice but to come out firing on all cylinders against LSU. Especially with that game being scheduled week 1 in Vegas. It's not an easy one to walk into. I do agree with you though. I think that if I were a betting man, which I'm not, I would think USC starts this year 2-1. And I think they show enough week 1. I don't think they win that Michigan game going into the Big House. I just think that's a brutal environment to go into. But I'm curious to see what happens. So yeah, that's my personal. That's founded off nothing but my own personal hunches. So yeah.
Yeah, and I've come to that same conclusion. I've repeated on this show a few times that I think a 2-1 start is probably a 75% likelihood. 1-2 is probably about 20%, and 0-3, right, is just a disaster. They're not going to start 3-0. We know that, and you're going to lose one of those two.
1-2. I think 1-2 is a little bit more. I put it more likely. Certainly, I think it's
okay.
I think 2-1 is certainly more likely, but I do think
part of this. I also have no faith in Brian Kelly in a season opener. Brian Kelly loses season openers better than anybody. If you were going to pick an opponent to have week 1 in like a marquee matchup, anyone that Brian Kelly's coaching is a pretty good choice. So we'll take that.
The one point that I would make, and I do think in general your view on LSU week 1 is very smart. I think the one point that I would make from USC's standpoint, to thinking about, well, LSU is heading in, new offensive coordinator, that's going to take time. Certainly true. I think from USC's standpoint, I think having a new defensive coordinator, a change can come quicker there in general when you're talking about a program. But USC has approached this offseason intentionally, deliberately, very slow when it comes to the install and just focusing on building the foundation first for communication and technique and that sort of thing. They did that through spring and then slowly integrated the install. And so that could be a really strong thing. I think when you look at it from a bird's eye view, that's probably a really good process, but it also could mean, hey, maybe these guys don't have an immediate 100% grasp of the scheme in week 1, that Dan Lynn's trying, and it could take, a couple of weeks before you officially set in there. So I think that's also a possibility from the defensive, side of things. Maybe
LSU's in the same boat with that as well, right? Their president, defensive coordinator, guy from Missouri who was great last year, but again, as you just explained very well with D'Anton Lynn, it's not an easy task to go and fix a bad defense. And right. In the same way that USC was a bad defense last year, LSU was a bad defense. So it's this, in many ways, this is the worst time of the season because there are so many questions and we do not have any data points to actually give us information to draw conclusions. In a week, we'll have some data points, still not enough to draw good conclusions, but at least to start to see the picture, right? Like the puzzle's still in the box right now. At least throw the pieces out on the table and let us see what the colors are. That's where we're going here. But before I let you go, Luca, just want to give you an opportunity. What are you working on right now? What can folks keep an eye out for in the lead up to opening week next weekend? What you might have coming out?
Yeah, keep an eye out for, we'll have in general season preview content, when it comes to, more standard offense, defense breakdown, some kind of projected, depth chart stuff. And then also, I think what will probably be a pretty interesting just future look at, again, like we've talked about, how Lincoln Riley's offense has evolved over the years, how things might, and will look different with Miller Moss as opposed to Caleb Williams, and just how, influential people, and, coaches throughout kind of Lincoln's background see both the Caleb Miller transition and the Big Ten transition as, how they see that impacting Lincoln's offense. So keep an eye out for that. And yeah, it's going to be an exciting week 1 for sure.
Well, be sure to follow Luca's work with the Southern California News Group. Also give him a follow on Twitter at by Luca Evans, correct?
Yes,
All
indeed.
righty. Well, that does it for this episode of the Believe in USC podcast. Next time we talk will be just a couple of days short of the opener. Luca, a pleasure to have you on and look forward to having you back on the show soon, brother.
Thanks, Cooper. Appreciate it. Look forward to the same.